Okay, welcome to mini lecture 2 for Module 5. In this kind of short, quick survey of the region, what I want to talk about primarily is the continent of Africa rather than Southwest Asia. And in this, what I'm going to talk about is the context of how its physical environment both is a challenge and is a potential for the region. So let's begin. First of all, what I want to talk a little bit about is this idea that the topography of a region strongly influences its development. Now, that doesn't mean that it is an absolute determinant of it. In other words, we can't simply say because of the physical environment, the culture, the people, the politics go a certain way. But it is something that has to be dealt with. And so we're going to look at it in terms of the topography, the river systems, then we're going to look at infrastructure. That is the human response to it. Okay, so let's think about this. If we look at the African continent primarily, although we're going to look, if you notice up here, at the southwesternmost portion of Southwest Asia, what we see is a relatively flat tabletop. And in that, along this edge, most notably, this is what we call the Rift Valley. And this is, in fact, where the continent of Africa is tearing itself apart. This part's moving this way, this part's moving this way, and this is a plate margin. There's another fracture here. But this means that this area is dropping. In other words, you have a big valley, and it's relatively active tectonically and volcanically. But the other aspect of this is that this ridge, in other words, if you have a valley, you have a wall and a ridge. This ridge kind of extends all the way around the continent, and we call this massive area the Great Escarpment. And it literally is that a scarp is a tall cliff-like feature. And so when you go, for example, from Mombasa on the coast in Kenya up to Nairobi, you're actually changing about 3,000 feet in elevation. It's rather remarkable. Now what that also does, though, is as rivers flow over those, you get a lot of energy. So there's a lot of water potential energy in those areas. We also know physically that this area right here, we're straddling the equator. So a massive landscape exists that gets a high amount of solar energy, direct sunlight. And because we have this massive desert here and here, we have a great deal of clear skies. In other words, I live in western Pennsylvania, and it's a pretty dreary place. That is not the case here. The number of sun days is very, very high. Now, what does this do? Well, again, let's take a look at this from a couple of standpoints. As I said, the Great Escarpment essentially is this complex of rather high, kind of one-sided mountains that go all the way around a significant portion of the African continent. In that, it means that we have highland areas throughout the center and very, very low coasts. That means also that the rivers flow from the interior rather complexly, and for the most part, we have a lot of rivers emptying to the west, a lot fewer major rivers emptying to the east. But the other problem with that is, unlike the rivers of North and South America and of Europe, these rivers are very difficult to navigate. They're easy at the coast, and they're easy in the interior, but there's always a point of significant falls, significant rapids, significant unnavigable components. And that makes these rivers very difficult to use, but that means they have huge hydroelectric potential. Now, of course, the major exceptions to that, the Nile, throughout much of its course, is highly navigable, and it always has been an important part of trade. You'll notice also up here the Tigris and Euphrates, and very important rivers in terms of the development of the Fertile Crescent. Remember, that's going to be on your quiz. Fertile Crescent is the area, the source of agriculture in Western civilization. And a significant part of the Congo is also quite navigable. Okay, so a lot of rivers, a lot of potential. But the other piece of this is that today in Africa, a significant portion of the continent is very low levels of electrification. That is, that you don't have electricity, something we just take for granted. electrification, in other words, a grid system, doesn't exist in a lot of the continent. You'll notice that much of Central Africa has very little electrification. Somewhere below 20% of the people have that access. Now, that's not true of the areas focusing on Nigeria here, nor in South Africa, nor along the coastal regions of North Africa. But the central portions of Africa, both east and west, have very, very low electrification rates. That and a very strange transportation system. And I want you to look at this. These are all the different rail gauges. In other words, that means that the distance between two rails are different. It means a train from one can't go to the other. But the other thing I want you to notice is because of the rivers challenges, what the colonial development did is built train systems. You notice all these train systems go from the interior to the coast, interior to the coast, interior to the coast, interior to the coast. But virtually no systems went between one coast to the other. In other words, you can't take a train across Africa. And that's because the colonial powers weren't interested in transporting people. They were interested in transporting raw materials from the interior to the coast. That idea changed how Africa developed. And they had to do that because all those rivers that in many other parts of the world would have been used were not usable. And so as the rivers did not produce good transportation, the colonial powers built an alternative, which was rail, but they didn't do it in the context of moving people between colonies. They did it to get colonial resources to the coast and to the parent, if you will, country. All right. Lastly, though, what I want to give you is a possibility. This is what we call the solar generation potential. And throughout the world, the transformation from non-renewable to renewable energy is beginning to pick up significantly. And what you'll notice is that more almost than anywhere else in the world, the continent of Africa and Southwest Asia has the greatest solar potential. All of Southwest Asia, even though right now it is one of the world's great oil producers, that is a non-renewable energy, has immense potential to produce solar energy. And that's true virtually across all of Africa. Extremely high solar potential. So it is not that this physical geography is only limits. There are great hydro potential. There's unbelievable solar potential. So the physical geography can both be a hindrance, depending on how people look at it, and the technology of the day, that is rail and river transport, or it can be great opportunities in terms of 21st century renewable energy production. Okay, that's it for Module 2. We'll pick it up in Module 3 with colonialism and decolonization.